I woke up in recovery, still tasting the anesthesia, and the first thing I did, before I even asked for water, was check my phone for photos from the rehearsal dinner. There weren't any of me. 43 photos in the family group chat, and I wasn't in a single one, because I was 2 floors up with a ruptured appendix and a drain tube taped to my side. My husband, Daniel, had gone back to the reception once a surgeon told him I was stable. I understood that. Someone had to be there for his sister. What I didn't understand yet was what his mother said to the table when someone asked where I was. "She's resting," Barbara told them. Then, quieter, not realizing a cousin was still recording for the wedding's highlight reel. "Honestly, it's probably better this way. Nobody wants surgery talk at a rehearsal dinner." That clip would end up mattering more than anyone at that table could have guessed. So would a folder I hadn't looked at in almost a year, sitting in a drawer in my home office, 40 miles from that hospital bed. I'm Nora. I was 52 that October, married to Daniel for 11 years. Cedar Hollow was his grandfather's land, 110 acres with a restored dairy barn where his sister Whitney had just gotten married. Its enormous doors groaning on their old iron tracks every time someone rolled them open. I loved that sound. Before I loved most of his family, honestly. 4 months before my own wedding to Daniel, Cedar Hollow had been 4 months from foreclosure. His father, Robert, had let the property taxes lapse 2 years running, pouring what little money the business made into events that weren't profitable enough to cover the barn's structural repairs. I'd just come into an inheritance from my grandmother, a little over $200,000 I hadn't told most people about. I loaned the family $180,000 of it that June. Not a gift, a loan, drawn up by my own attorney, secured by a lien recorded against the property at the county clerk's office. Robert signed it, grateful, a little embarrassed, and told me he'd never forget it. He didn't forget it right away. For the first couple of years, he'd mention it quietly at holidays. A thank you passed across a table when nobody else was listening. That habit faded faster than the debt did, and 11 years and a decade of quiet upkeep later, I was lying in a hospital bed while his family decided, without me in the room, what my role in that place had actually been. I found out exactly how they'd decided it 2 days later, at a brunch Barbara hosted so Whitney could open the gifts nobody had time for during the reception. I was still moving carefully, one hand pressed to my side, discharged that morning against my own better judgment because I didn't want to miss it. Someone mentioned the barn's restoration, how far the place had come, and I said, gently, that I still remembered how close it came to closing before the renovation. Barbara didn't even look up from the ribbon she was untying. "You just kept the lights on, Nora," she said. "That's not the same as building something." Nobody at the table corrected her. Whitney laughed, not unkindly, the way you laugh at something you've heard phrased that way before, like it was simply understood. That was when I understood. It wasn't one comment, said in a rough week recovering from surgery. It was the family's whole version of events. And I'd apparently missed the meeting where everyone agreed on it. I didn't correct her. I finished my coffee, admired the gift wrap, and let Daniel drive me home before the pain medication wore off. It wasn't grace that kept me quiet that morning. It was 10 years of practice at deciding on my own that being useful was enough, and that being seen was a different thing I'd never actually needed. I remember looking out the car window on the drive home, past the turnoff for Cedar Hollow, and thinking about the very first time I'd stood under those barn doors, years before Daniel and I were even engaged, back when the place still smelled like sawdust and unfinished promises. Robert used to walk the property with me on Sunday afternoons back then, pointing out what he wanted to fix first, like a man narrating a future he wasn't sure he could afford. I believed in that future, before I had any legal reason to. That was the part Barbara's comment had actually gotten wrong, I thought, staring out at the fence line going by. It wasn't that I'd kept the lights on instead of building something. It was that I'd never once separated the two. What I didn't say to Barbara that morning was how much of the last decade she'd just erased in one sentence. There was the winter, 3 years in, when the walk-in cooler failed 2 days before a January wedding, and Robert called me, not Daniel, because he knew I'd have a rental company on the phone within the hour. There was the summer the county reassessed the property, and the tax bill came in $11,000 higher than Robert had budgeted, and I sat with him at his kitchen table, restructuring the payment schedule on my own note so he wouldn't miss a mortgage payment. There was a bridge loan in year 7, smaller, paid back within 4 months, that let him break ground on a second event space before the bank's own financing came through. 3 separate times over a decade, in one form or another. Only one of those times ever got written down in a way anyone but my attorney would see. There was also the 15-year retrospective dinner Barbara hosted the year before Whitney's wedding. A slideshow of the barn's transformation projected against the hayloft wall. Before and after photos of the roof, the floors, the new wiring. I sat through the whole thing next to Daniel. My name wasn't mentioned once. Not maliciously, I think, just because nobody had ever thought to include it. Barbara got a standing ovation at the end of that dinner. I got a compliment on the dessert I'd brought. I told myself, driving home that night, that it didn't matter. I'd been telling myself that for most of a decade. I found out how much worse it actually was 3 weeks after the brunch, once I was back on my feet and Daniel mentioned, almost offhand, that his father had already met with a loan officer about refinancing Cedar Hollow into a full commercial venue. I asked when. Daniel said the week I was still in the hospital. Robert had told the bank he could get the paperwork moving quickly, that things on his end were flexible right now while I was recovering, and that he hadn't needed much involvement from anyone else to get started. He hadn't mentioned the lien to the loan officer at all. Not because he was hiding it, Daniel thought, because he'd genuinely stopped thinking of it as something that still required me. I sat with that for a while. My own recovery had become, without anyone deciding it out loud, a convenient window for a decision that involved my money and my name on a county record. Nobody had asked whether I was well enough to be consulted. Nobody had thought to ask at all. I kept coming back to one detail Daniel mentioned, almost as an afterthought. The loan officer had asked Robert who else held an interest in the property, and Robert had said, without hesitating, that it was just him and Barbara. 10 years of payments on my note, and I'd become a footnote he'd genuinely forgotten to mention. I went looking for the rest of it that same week. A regional bridal magazine had run a feature on Cedar Hollow 2 years earlier, the kind of spread Robert used to book new couples, all about how his own determination had saved his father's land. My name wasn't in it. Neither was the money. Whitney's wedding website still had an Our Story page about the venue's history, the family's version, with the loan simply left out. Barbara had gotten a full page in the county's regional living magazine the year before that, photographed in the barn she'd redesigned, praised for her eye for turning the place into something couples wanted. She'd gotten the credit. I had a folder in a drawer with a recorded lien nobody but my own attorney knew was still active. Whitney's website even had a paragraph about how the family came together to save the venue after the near foreclosure. No names attached, no numbers, just the phrase floating there, doing the work of covering for whoever needed it to. I read that paragraph 3 times, sitting at my own kitchen counter, and thought about how easy it would have been for someone, at any point in 10 years, to add one sentence. It never had to be dramatic. It just never happened. I didn't say anything to Barbara or Robert. What I did, quietly, from my own kitchen, was call the attorney who'd drawn up the note 10 years earlier and ask her to pull the lien's current status. It was still active. $11,000 outstanding, a balance that had sat unpaid for 2 years. Robert had made steady payments for most of a decade, and then let the last of it slide, the way you let a bill slide when nobody's calling about it. I didn't call about it either. Not yet. I wanted to understand exactly what I was holding before I decided what to do with it.
6 weeks passed after that, and from the outside, nothing about my life looked any different. I went to a Sunday dinner where Barbara mentioned, without looking at me, how nice it was that the whole family had pulled together for Whitney's wedding. I smiled and passed the potatoes. I drove Whitney to pick up her dress from alterations, the two of us talking about nothing in particular, and didn't say a word about the loan officer or the lien sitting open in a document on my laptop at home. I helped Barbara address thank you cards one Tuesday evening, sitting at her dining table for 2 hours writing addresses in my neatest handwriting, while she told me, unprompted, how relieved she was that everyone had really shown up for Whitney this year. I didn't ask what she meant by everyone. That was the hardest part, honestly. Not the silence itself. How ordinary I had to make it look. My attorney, meanwhile, did the parts I couldn't do from a kitchen table. She confirmed the exact language of the lien, pulled the county's recorded copy to make sure nothing had been altered or refiled, and walked me through what a release would require once the balance was paid. She asked more than once if I wanted to send Robert a formal demand letter, get the $11,000 moving faster instead of waiting. I told her no. Not yet. I wasn't trying to force anything. Some nights during those 6 weeks, I sat at my kitchen table with the lien documentation printed out next to my laptop, thinking about how a piece of paper could sit quietly in a filing system for 10 years, ignored by everyone, including me, and still mean exactly what it had always meant the whole time. I thought, too, about the standing ovation Barbara got at Cedar Hollow's 15-year retrospective dinner the year before, full of before and after photos of the barn, my name in none of it. I got a compliment on the dessert I'd brought that night. I used to tell myself that didn't matter. Sitting there 6 weeks into this, I finally let myself admit it always had. I kept thinking about a comment Daniel made early in our marriage, about how his family took care of each other. Said with real pride. I used to agree with him. During those 6 weeks, I noticed, for the first time really noticing it, how one-directional that care had always been. Robert had called me during 3 emergencies over 10 years, and I'd shown up without being asked twice. I had never once called him during one of mine, partly because there hadn't been many, but partly, I realized, because I doubted he'd have known what to do with the call, even before the appendix, even before the hospital bed he never once asked to see. I thought about that a lot during those 6 weeks, more than I expected to. Robert had visited the hospital exactly once, for 11 minutes, mostly to ask Daniel about parking. Barbara hadn't come at all, though she'd sent a fruit basket to the house 2 weeks later, addressed to both of us, as if the surgery had happened to Daniel, too. I wasn't angry about the fruit basket. I was just starting to notice, item by item, how consistently I'd been the one extending myself toward that family, and how rarely anyone had thought to check whether the reverse was even possible. Then Robert brought it up directly, at a Sunday dinner near the end of that stretch. He and Barbara were ready to move on the refinance, he said. The bank just needed the title cleared, some old paperwork from years back his attorney would sort out. He said it like a formality,
between the salad course and dessert. He'd clearly forgotten, or never fully registered, that the lien was still recorded, still active, still requiring my signature to release. I didn't say anything that night. I let the bank's title search move on its own timeline. I already knew what it would find, because I'd confirmed it myself weeks earlier. An active lien, $11,000 outstanding, recorded against the entire property, in my name. I stopped being quiet out of hurt somewhere in those 6 weeks, and started being quiet on purpose instead. Those are different things, and it took me most of a decade to learn the difference. I didn't rehearse a confrontation. I didn't draft a speech for a dinner table. I let the paperwork be what it had always been, recorded, patient, waiting for someone to finally read it. The call came in November, at Cedar Hollow's 15th anniversary open house, the event Barbara had spent months planning, to showcase the venue before the refinance closed. She'd strung the whole barn in warm white lights, hired a string quartet instead of the usual playlist, printed a booklet on the property's history to hand out at the door. The same kind of glossy booklet as before, updated now, still without my name in it. Prospective clients wandered the grounds with wine glasses, admiring the restored beams, the repaired foundation, the 110 acres that had nearly gone to auction 15 years earlier, and were now, by every outward appearance, simply thriving. I stood near the back of the barn during Robert's welcome toast, listening to him thank the guests for coming to celebrate 15 years of Cedar Hollow's story. Barbara moved through the crowd the way she always did at these events, effortless, gracious, pointing out the restored hayloft to a couple who looked like they were already imagining their own wedding there. Someone asked her how long the family had owned the land, and she said, "Over a century," which was true, and left it there, which wasn't the whole answer. For a moment, watching her, I thought about how much of what she was showing off that night existed only because of decisions made at a kitchen table she'd never sat at, on a note she'd never once asked to see. Robert's phone rang during his second toast, the one about the future, about the next 15 years. He glanced at the screen, apologized to the room with an easy laugh, and stepped outside to take it. I watched through the barn's sliding doors as his face changed under the string of lights Barbara had hung along the frame. He came back a few minutes later and asked quietly if I'd step outside with him. The bank's closing attorney had just told him the refinance couldn't proceed until the lien was resolved and the lien holder signed a release. He hadn't remembered the note was ever left unfinished. He asked me, standing by the same doors I used to stand under before any of us had a legal claim on this place, if I knew anything about it. "I know everything about it," I said. "I've known for 10 years. I'm the lien holder." I told him I'd sign the release the day the $11,000 was paid, the way the note always required. I told him I wasn't trying to take the venue from anyone. I told him I was tired of being the reason something survived without ever being part of the story of how. Barbara found us by the doors a few minutes later, the party still going behind her, string quartet still playing, guests still admiring a version of Cedar Hollow's history that didn't have my name anywhere in the booklet in their hands. She was quieter than I'd ever seen her, holding her own elbows like she was cold despite the warm night. She didn't apologize the way people do in movies. "I didn't know it was still outstanding," she said. Then, after a moment, "I didn't know it was ever that much." I told her it always had been. She looked at the doors a while before she looked back at me. "I said you just kept the lights on," she said. "I think I meant it as smaller than it was." That was as close to an apology as Barbara had ever come.
and I let it be enough. Daniel found me by the barn a little later, once most of the guests had gone. He'd heard the whole thing secondhand from his father, piece by piece, including the part about the loan officer and the recovery window. He didn't say much. He just stood next to me, quiet, and said, "I never understood how much you carried, or how easily we all let you carry it alone, even the week you were in a hospital bed. I'm sorry I didn't see it." I believed him. Robert paid the balance within the month. I signed the release the day it cleared. Barbara doesn't say, "kept the lights on" anymore. She's more careful now, and once, at a dinner months later, when a cousin repeated the old version of the story, she was the one who corrected it before I had to. Cedar Hollow still stands. The barn doors still groan on their old iron tracks every time someone rolls them open. It turned out the loudest thing in that family was never the barn doors. It was everything they'd assumed I'd never notice being left out of, even from a hospital bed. If you've ever quietly carried something that kept the people around you standing, I hope this one felt like it was for you. If it did, subscribe. We post new stories every week. Is there something you've quietly done for your family that they still don't fully know about? Tell me in the comments.